Ladies and gentlemen, today we address a silent struggle, a truth often left unspoken. The dark reality of living alone, without a companion, without the warmth of a woman by your side. Society has told us that independence is power, that solitude is strength. But what happens when isolation becomes a prison? What happens when self-sufficiency turns into silent suffering? There is a cost to being alone, and today we will confront it. Some men wear their solitude like a badge of honor, but deep down in the quiet of the night, in the silence of an empty home, there is a void. A man without companionship faces battles unseen, emotional, spiritual, and even physical. It is not merely about having a girlfriend or a partner. It is about understanding the very fabric of human connection, about realizing that we were not created to be alone. I will give you 8 powerful truths that will shake the foundation of this loneliness. Truths that may be uncomfortable but necessary. If you have found yourself walking this path of solitude, listen closely. If you are choosing to remain alone, be warned. What you may think is freedom could very well be bondage in disguise. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of purpose in relationship. There is a deception that many have embraced, a deception that tells them they are alone simply because there is no one around. But loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of meaningful connection. You can be surrounded by a crowd and still feel empty. You can have conversations with dozens, even hundreds, yet still feel unheard. The issue is not about being alone. It is about being disconnected from what truly matters. A man who chooses to live without a woman in his life often convinces himself that he is free, that he has avoided the complications of relationships, but what he has also done, often unknowingly, is remove himself from the very thing that gives life meaning, connection. Every man, no matter how independent or self-reliant, has been created with a need for companionship. It is not weakness. It is divine design. From the beginning of time, man was never meant to walk alone. Even Adam, in all his perfection, was incomplete without Eve. But here's where many men fail to see the bigger picture. The absence of a woman does not just mean the absence of romance. It means the absence of balance, accountability, and refinement. A woman does more than provide affection. She reflects a man back to himself. Without this reflection, a man can fall into a cycle of self-deception. He convinces himself that he is doing well, that he is strong, that he is thriving. But without someone to challenge him, to nurture him, to see his blind spots, he is left to his own devices. Many men who isolate themselves slowly lose touch with reality. Their world becomes smaller, their interactions more surface level, their purpose less defined. The absence of a relationship does not merely leave an emotional void, it leaves a spiritual one. Because when a man has no one to love, no one to protect, no one to lead, he begins to question why he is even striving at all. He may pour himself into work, into hobbies, into distractions, but at the end of the day, he will feel the weight of his own emptiness. A man without purpose in relationships is a man who is drifting, and drifting is dangerous. When a man has no anchor, no reason to push forward beyond himself, he becomes his own worst enemy. He starts to fill the void with things that do not satisfy, excessive entertainment, superficial pleasures, and even destructive habits. Because in the absence of real connection, the soul hungers for something, anything, to fill the space where love was meant to reside. What many men fail to understand is that loneliness is not just a feeling, it is a warning sign. It is the soul crying out for what it was created for. And the longer that warning is ignored, the deeper the emptiness becomes. Some men become hardened, convincing themselves they do not need anyone. Others fall into despair, struggling with unseen battles of the mind. But the reality remains the same. A life without meaningful relationships is a life unfulfilled. So the question is not whether you can live without a woman. The question is, are you truly living? A man who chooses to live in isolation may think he is protecting himself from pain, disappointment, or responsibility. He may believe that avoiding relationships will keep his life simple, free from conflict and unnecessary burdens. But what he fails to realize is that isolation is not a sanctuary. It is a slow and silent form of self-destruction. When a man withdraws from meaningful relationships, he does not just remove distractions, he removes the very forces that shape him into a stronger, wiser, and more disciplined person. Without companionship, accountability disappears. There is no one to challenge his thoughts, to push him toward growth, or to remind him of his potential. He becomes his own ruler, living by his own standards, answering only to himself. And that, my friends, is dangerous. A man left alone for too long begins to deteriorate. His habits become erratic, his discipline fades, his motivation weakens. He may still function, he may go to work, pay his bills, and carry on with his routine, but inside something is eroding. The human mind and spirit were never designed to operate in prolonged solitude. The very structure of our psychology thrives on interaction, on the sharpening effect of being around others. When that is taken away, a man starts to lose grip on the very things that once made him strong. First, isolation affects his mind. He begins to overthink, to dwell on things that would have been minor in the presence of companionship. Small problems become mountains. Simple challenges become overwhelming. There is no external voice to bring balance, to offer perspective, to say it's not as bad as you think. Instead, his thoughts loop endlessly, unchecked, unchallenged, often spiraling into negativity. Then it affects his emotions. A man who isolates himself often believes he is maintaining control over his life. But in reality, he is losing control over his emotions. Without someone to share his burdens, his struggles, or even his joys, he starts to internalize everything. Frustration builds. Resentment festers. Anger becomes more frequent. Sadness turns into an ever-present shadow. He may not even realize it, but slowly his heart hardens. He becomes less patient, less compassionate, less capable of deep connection. And finally, isolation affects his spirit. A man without meaningful relationships starts to drift spiritually. He may once have had vision, a sense of direction, a reason to wake up with purpose. But over time, without someone to share his journey, that purpose fades. He starts to wonder what all his effort is for. He may seek pleasure in temporary distractions, entertainment, social media, unhealthy habits, but none of it fills the void. Because deep inside, a man knows that life is not meant to be lived in solitude. He may suppress it, When a man lives in isolation, he believes he is in control. He thinks that by keeping others at a distance, he is protecting himself from harm, betrayal, or disappointment. But what he doesn't realize is that in solitude, he is left alone with his greatest enemy himself. Without external forces to challenge him, to refine him, to hold him accountable, he becomes vulnerable to his own weaknesses. Every man has struggles, temptations, and flaws. Some wrestle with laziness, some with pride, others with destructive habits or negative thought patterns. In the presence of relationships, these weaknesses are exposed and confronted. A good woman will call out a man's inconsistency. A close friend will challenge him when he is slipping. A strong community will remind him of his values. But when a man is alone, there is no one to challenge him, no one to hold up a mirror to his faults, no one to say, "You are better than this." The mind, when left unchecked, is a dangerous place. A man in isolation starts to justify behaviors that he once knew were harmful. He convinces himself that sleeping in every day is fine because no one is waiting for him. He tells himself that skipping the gym, eating poorly, or avoiding responsibilities doesn't matter because there is no one to impress. He allows his standards to slip not all at once, but gradually in small ways, until one day he wakes up and realizes he has become someone he never intended to be. Without accountability, bad habits take root. Procrastination turns into a lifestyle. Small indulgences turn into addictions. The discipline that once defined him erodes. And because no one is there to see it happen, he does not feel the urgency to correct himself. A man alone can fall into cycles of self-destruction without even recognizing it, because there is no external force pulling him back to his best self. Beyond habits, isolation leaves a man defenseless against his own thoughts. Without companionship, his inner dialogue becomes louder, and not always in a good way. He begins to dwell on regrets, overanalyze past mistakes, and entertain self-doubt. He may develop resentment toward the world, blaming others for his loneliness instead of taking responsibility for his own choices. Depression can creep in unnoticed, disguised as apathy, as a lack of motivation, as an increasing preference for numbness over engagement with life. The truth is, no man is strong enough to battle his own weaknesses alone. That is why iron sharpens iron, why people thrive in relationships, why great men are often surrounded by those who push them to be greater. Strength is not the absence of struggle, it is the ability to rise above it. But when a man isolates himself, he removes the very tools that help him rise. He may believe he is protecting himself, but in reality, he is leaving himself defenseless against the slow erosion of his own potential. Without emotional connection, the mind decays. A man may survive without a romantic relationship, but he cannot thrive without emotional connection. The mind, like the body, requires nourishment. It needs stimulation and interaction and engagement to stay sharp, focused, and healthy. When a man isolates himself, believing that he is better off alone, he unknowingly deprives his mind of the very elements that keep it strong. Over time, this deprivation leads to mental stagnation, emotional numbness, and even in cognitive decline. Emotional connection is not just about feeling loved, it is about intellectual and psychological engagement. A conversation with someone who challenges your perspective forces you to think in ways you wouldn't on your own. A debate with a loved one sharpens your ability to reason. A deep discussion about goals, dreams, and fears keeps your mind engaged in the realities of life. But when a man removes himself from these interactions, his thinking becomes repetitive. His thoughts cycle in the same patterns, unchallenged, unchecked, and increasingly detached from reality. Without emotional connection, a man's mind starts to retreat inward. He may believe he is content in his solitude, but in truth he is simply becoming accustomed to an unchallenged existence. He no longer questions his assumptions because there is no one to do so. He no longer refines his opinions because they are never confronted. He becomes rigid in his thinking, resistant to growth, and unaware of how much he is missing. This isolation also affects memory, focus, and decision-making. Studies have shown that social interaction stimulates brain activity, helping to maintain cognitive function. When a man engages in conversations, shares experiences, or expresses emotions, his brain is actively forming new neural connections. But when these interactions are absent, the mind becomes sluggish. It loses its agility. Simple tasks start to feel more complicated. Creativity fades. Problem solving becomes more difficult. Not because the intelligence is gone, but because it is no longer being exercised. And then comes the emotional toll. A man without emotional connection begins to feel an emptiness that he cannot fully explain. He may tell himself he is fine, that he enjoys his own company, that he is self-sufficient. But deep inside, his mind knows the truth. It is starving. The human brain is wired for connection. It craves engagement, interaction, and meaningful relationships. When those are removed, the mind begins to deteriorate. Not in a way that is immediately obvious, but in subtle, corrosive ways that become undeniable over time. A man without emotional connection may not notice the decay of his mind at first. He may even take pride in his independence, but as the years go by, he will start to feel it. The dullness, the mental fatigue, the lack of passion for life. His world will shrink, his mind will weaken, and the things that once excited him will seem distant and unimportant. Because without emotional connection, a man does not just lose relationships, he loses the sharpness, the vitality, and the very essence of what makes him fully alive. Loneliness leads to self-doubt and a loss of confidence. A man who isolates himself may begin with the belief that he is strong, independent, and fully capable of handling life on his own. He tells himself that he doesn't need anyone, that he is better off without the distractions, compromises, or emotional investments of relationships. But over time, something begins to shift. What started as a confident choice slowly turns into uncertainty, hesitation, and a quiet but growing sense of self-doubt. Confidence is not something a man simply decides to have. It is built and reinforced through interaction with the world. It is shaped by the challenges he faces, the encouragement he receives, the affirmations of his worth from those who see him for who he truly is. When a man is engaged with others, his confidence is tested, refined, and strengthened. He learns through experience that he is capable, valuable, and worthy. But when he removes himself from relationships, when he has no one to affirm, challenge, or believe in him, his confidence begins to erode. At first, the changes are subtle. A man who once walked with his head high begins to second-guess his decisions. He hesitates where he used to act boldly. He becomes more cautious, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of making a mistake. Because there is no one to reassure him, no one to push him forward, no one to remind him of his strengths. His self-image becomes uncertain. The more time he spends alone, the more his inner voice turns from one of certainty to one of hesitation. And then the doubt takes deeper root. He begins to wonder if he is truly enough. If he was truly valuable, wouldn't someone be there for him? If he was truly strong, wouldn't he feel stronger? He may not say it out loud, but deep inside, the loneliness starts to whisper lies. Lies that tell him he is not worthy of love. Lies that make him believe he is less than he once thought. Lies that convince him that his solitude is not a choice, but a reflection of his inadequacy. This loss of confidence affects everything. A man without confidence will struggle in his career because he will not believe in his own ability to succeed. He will struggle in social settings because he will fear rejection or embarrassment. He will struggle in his personal life because he will doubt whether he is truly capable of being loved or respected. And the longer he remains isolated, the harder it becomes to break free from this cycle. True confidence is not built in solitude. It is built in engagement in relationships, in the experiences that challenge and strengthen a man's sense of self. Without people to sharpen him, without voices to uplift him, without love to remind him of his worth, his confidence does not grow, it fades. And when confidence fades, everything in his life follows. A life without companionship leads to emotional numbness. At first, a man living alone may feel a sense of peace. No drama, no arguments, no emotional burdens to carry. He tells himself that solitude is freedom, that he is in control of his emotions, that he doesn't need anyone to complete him. But as the years go by, something unexpected happens. The highs and lows of life begin to flatten. The joys don't feel as joyful. The sorrows don't feel as painful. He is no longer experiencing life in full color. Everything begins to feel muted, distant, and indifferent. This is emotional numbness. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process creeping in unnoticed until one day a man realizes he hasn't truly felt anything in a long time. He may laugh at a joke, but it doesn't reach his soul. He may watch an inspiring moment, but it doesn't stir him the way it used to. He may hear good or bad news, but his reaction is delayed, as if he is watching life through a thick glass rather than truly living it. The human heart was not designed for isolation. It thrives on connection, on shared experiences, on the emotional exchange between people. Every time a man loves, forgives, fights for something meaningful, or even faces conflict, his heart is engaged. He feels alive because his emotions are active, responding to the people around him. But when those connections are removed, the emotional muscles weaken. The heart, like any other part of the body, atrophies when it is not used. At first, this numbness may seem like strength. A man tells himself he is unaffected, that he has mastered his emotions, that nothing bothers him. But in reality, this is not strength, it is detachment. He has not conquered his emotions, he has simply disconnected from them. And this disconnection has a cost. Without emotional engagement, life begins to lose meaning. The small things that once brought joy, a deep conversation, a shared meal, a meaningful touch, become insignificant. Achievements feel hollow because there is no one to celebrate them. Struggles feel heavier because there is no one to share the burden. A man in this state may not even recognize his own suffering because numbness does not announce itself, it simply replaces everything else. Without emotional engagement, life begins to lose meaning. The small things that once brought joy, a deep conversation, a shared meal, a meaningful touch, become insignificant. Achievements feel hollow because there is no one to celebrate them. Struggles feel heavier because there is no one to share the burden. A man in this state may not even recognize his own suffering because numbness does not announce itself, it simply replaces everything else. This is why men in isolation often seek distractions. They turn to entertainment, excessive work, material success, or even unhealthy habits to fill the void. But no matter how much they chase, consume, or accomplish, the emptiness remains. Because what they need is not another achievement, not another distraction, but real human connection. The heart needs to feel. It needs to love, to be loved, to experience both joy and pain. Without that, a man does not just lose emotions, he loses the essence of what makes life worth living. A man without love loses his purpose. A man may convince himself that he doesn't need love, that he is content walking through life alone. He may even find comfort in his routines, his work, and his personal ambitions. But over time, something begins to feel missing, something deeper than success, deeper than personal achievement. That missing piece is purpose. Because no matter how much a man builds, earns, or accomplishes, if he has no one to share it with, it all begins to feel meaningless. Purpose is not just about having goals, it is about having a reason to wake up every morning with passion and direction. Love, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, gives life that meaning. It creates stakes, responsibilities, and motivations beyond personal gain. A man in love doesn't just work for himself, he works for the people he cares about. He doesn't just grow for his own benefit, he grows to become a better partner, father, brother, or friend. Love makes his efforts matter on a level that personal ambition alone never can. When love is absent, a man's purpose starts to shift inward. His focus turns solely to himself, his comfort, his security, his success. But the problem with a self-centered life is that it lacks fulfillment. He may reach the highest levels of personal achievement, but without love, those achievements feel empty. There is no greater joy than knowing that what you do impacts someone else, that your existence brings happiness, security, and strength to another person. This is why even the most successful men can feel lost in loneliness. They may have wealth, influence, and power, but without love, they struggle to find joy in any of it. They search for purpose in temporary pleasures and distractions, in workaholism, but nothing truly satisfies. Because purpose is not found in what a man has, it is found in who he loves, and who loves him in return. A life without love is a life without legacy. What a man builds alone may stand for a time, but it will not last beyond him. Love, however, creates something eternal. It shapes generations, influences lives, and leaves an imprint far greater than any personal success ever could. Without love, a man risks not only losing his sense of purpose, but also leaving behind nothing of real significance when he is gone. The greatest men in history were not simply great because of their accomplishments, they were great because of who they impacted. They built not just empires, but families, friendships, and communities. They understood that true purpose is not found in isolation, but in connection. A man without love may survive, but he will never truly live. Isolation makes a man vulnerable to despair. At first, solitude can feel like strength. A man believes he is self-sufficient, free from emotional burdens, unshaken by the distractions of relationships. He tells himself that he is in control of his own life, his own happiness, his own destiny. But as time passes, that solitude begins to take a darker turn. The silence that once felt peaceful starts to feel empty. The freedom that once seemed empowering begins to feel lonely. And the absence of companionship becomes something much heavier than he ever expected, something that slowly invites despair. A man without companionship has no external voice to challenge his darkest thoughts. When life brings difficulties, there is no one to remind him of his worth, no one to encourage him, no one to lift him up when he feels weak. In moments of doubt, he has only his own mind to rely on, and when that mind is clouded with loneliness, it is far too easy for negativity to take over. Small struggles feel bigger when faced alone. a failure at work, a financial setback, a moment of personal weakness, these are things that a man could overcome with support, but without it they linger. They weigh heavier than they should. They turn into self-criticism, into regret, into a sense of hopelessness. And the longer he stays isolated, the harder it becomes to escape this downward spiral. Despair thrives in isolation because it removes all the things that keep a man grounded: love, encouragement, accountability, and perspective. A man who has someone by his side can be reminded of the good in himself, of the progress he has made, of the hope that still exists. But a man who is alone has only his own perception, and when that perception is clouded by loneliness, it distorts everything. This is why isolated men often struggle with depression, anxiety, and a sense of meaninglessness. They may not recognize it at first, but the symptoms are there: a lack of motivation, a loss of interest in things they once enjoyed, a creeping numbness that makes life feel dull and unimportant. They may distract themselves with work, entertainment, or unhealthy habits, but none of it truly fills the void. And then comes the greatest danger, the belief that nothing will ever change, that they are meant to be alone, that they are unworthy of love, that their struggles are theirs to bear in silence. This is the lie that despair tells them. Without someone to challenge it, it can consume even the strongest of men. No man is meant to walk through life alone. Strength is not in isolation, it is in connection. It is in the relationships that remind a man of his worth, in the love that keeps his heart alive, in the voices that speak hope when he cannot find it himself. Because when a man is alone for too long, the greatest battle he faces is not the world outside, but the darkness that grows within.